Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final panel of the day. My name is Mary Andruskevich. I'm one of the many volunteers for this year's symposium. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the moderator for our final panel of the day, Paul Michelman, who's the editor-in-chief of the MIT Sloan Management Review. So let's welcome Paul to the stage, please, where he's going to introduce the topic and then bring out the panelists. Thank you all for being here.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you for all of you for seeing this day through with us, or almost through. The disconnect between strategy, what companies say they're going to accomplish, what they say they're going to focus on, and what actually happens day to day in the organization is one of the most pernicious, intractable, and frustrating problems in all of management. And I love moderating this panel because I get to use words like pernicious and intractable. You know, thousands of book pages have been written on this topic. Untold millions have been spent on professional service fees trying to better align strategy and execution, and yet the problem persists. And I think at its core, the problem is so difficult because it's caused by so many different factors. And in just a second, our panelists will introduce us to a number of those factors, and then we'll dig in how to solve against those things, how to improve the strategy execution gap. But I'd like to begin the discussion with a theory, and that is this problem begins at the top. As I was thinking about this panel, I was reminded of a quote by former Massachusetts governor and presidential candidate Mike Dukakis, who quipped during the 1988 presidential campaign, "Fish rots from the head down." And that led me to think of a joke, and I'm going to share it with you, and you can feel free to share it with your party guests and have them rolling in the aisles over the years. Why is strategy like a fish? Because it rots from the head down. The problem with the strategy execution gap begins with the setting and communicating of strategy. So let me share a couple of data points. Don Sull and his team of researchers at MIT Sloan have been studying the strategy execution gap for a number of years, and they've just published a terrific series in MIT Sloan Management Review called the Strategic Agility Initiative, and I hope you'll all check it out, and I hope you'll forgive me for that very quick commercial message. I want to cherry pick a couple of data points, and we'll do this we'll do a pop quiz or a poll, if you like. One of the research engagements that Don and his team did was to interview the 11 members of the executive team, so the top team of a large technology company who shall remain nameless, and their executives should thank me for keeping them nameless. Don asked each executive to list the company's top 5 strategic priorities. These were the 5 publicly available, published tenets of the company's strategy, the objectives that were meant to kind of tune the organization over the next 3 to 5 years. Raise your hands if you think all 11 members of the top tier could name their company's top 5 strategic objectives. You guys know the fix is in. Okay, how many think 10 could? 9? Could 8 of 11 name their top 5 priorities? You're way too smart for me. Okay, how about 5? Could 5 members of the team? Okay, so maybe a quarter of you think 5. Well, the answer is 4. 4 of the 11 members of the top executive team at this company could list their company's 5 strategic priorities. Now, how many do you think were able to only list 0 or 1? How about 0? Do you think everyone could list at least 2? How many people could only list, let's say 3? Could only 3 people list 0 or 1? All right, thank you for helping me out. The answer is 5. 5 members of the executive team could list 1 or fewer of the strategic priorities they were charged with leading, that presumably they had a hand in creating. More people could name 0 or 1 than could name all 5, and the other people fell somewhere in between. And before you go writing this off as some kind of dysfunctional outlier, Don and his team did similar research with 124 other organizations. They asked executive teams and other executives to name their company's top 3 strategic priorities. And again, these are published objectives available in annual reports on their website, other places. What percent of top leadership teams across all of these companies studied, 125 of them, large organizations, what percent of the executive team could name the top 3 strategic priorities? So we won't start too high. How many think 3/4 of the team could list the top 3? Now, we've heard this record before. 67%, 50%. You're right, okay, so it's not all bad news. In fact, 51% of the executive teams could list their company's top 3 priorities. So it means it can be done, but it's very clear that strategy rots from the head down, and that rot only increases. In that same study, Don and his team asked senior executives outside of the top team. So these are business unit managers, functional leaders, senior people in the organization. 22% could name their company's top 3 strategic priorities. 18% of middle managers could name their company's top 3 strategic priorities, and 13% of frontline supervisors. Perhaps the people who actually have the most influence on how the organization acts every day could list their company's top 3 strategic priorities. But it's not all bad news. The good news is we have a fantastic panel of experts who are going to help us solve this problem, or at least advance our understanding of the problem and some solutions towards it. So will you please join me in welcoming Anthony Christie, Chief Operating Officer of Trace3, Cathy Horst Forsyth, founder and managing partner of Strongbow Consulting, Mike Macrie, Senior Vice President and CIO of Land of Lakes, and Irving Wladawsky-Berger, a fellow at our own MIT initiative on the digital economy. Panelists, thank you. No pressure. So we're going to get to some solutions. And I should say, these folks aren't randomly selected. These are experienced leaders who have lived through the strategy execution wars. They may have been a little bloody, but they are unbowed, and they are here to share their experience. But before we get to the solution, I think we should look at the problem a little bit more holistically. And so I'm going to ask each panelist to contribute one more factor for why the strategy execution gap is such a big problem. And Anthony, let's begin with you.
I'm happy to start. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As Paul said, there's a host of reasons. We're asked to give one. One that comes to mind for me that I've actually seen happen time and time again that just widens this gap is peer pressure. And what I mean by peer pressure is I can't think of the number of times that a team has brought a great idea in front of us, and you know they've gone and have been, shall we say, a tad too over-optimistic with what the business results should be. And part of the reason for that is peer pressure. They want to gain favor. They want to gain favor, you know, with their peers. They want to advance their project or their business plan, almost to the point of it being a tad unrealistic. And it's a shame because, you know, I've seen a number of really promising ideas get shuttered before their time. And often it's really easy to look and say, well, that's because management isn't insightful or leadership is not patient. On the contrary, it's the teams themselves that are putting the milestones out there, and at times, you know, sometimes we're being woefully missed, right? So what do we do? A couple of things that we've done, and I'm not saying that this is the cure-all, but we've asked teams to come in and say, what does a grand slam look like? What does a likely case look like? And then what's your low case look like in terms of business outcomes? And then haircut all of those numbers, all of those results, the number of customers, your profit, your growth, et cetera. And if you still like what that low case looks like after you've given it a haircut, there could be something there, right? So my one would be peer pressure.
Very good. Cathy.
Very good. Good afternoon. Well, just for context, Strongbow is a consulting company that focuses on helping large enterprise drive infrastructure and network transformation programs. So think Fortune 10, Fortune 100 companies and helping them modernize their infrastructure and technology. So the reason we specifically focus on such large companies is because driving successful change programs is exceedingly difficult at scale. And if you think about one of our projects, typically we're working with engineering, architecture, operations, procurement, sourcing, compliance, legal, and so on and so forth. Each of these organizations has their own mission, their own metrics, their own priorities, and they're rewarded differently. So just getting the organizations to come together to unify in a common purpose and drive change is exceedingly difficult. On a good day, we're successful. On a bad day, the interdepartmental and cross-organizational politics really do get in the way. And I don't know that many large companies would like to admit that politics are a factor, and they can absolutely and do fly in the face of successfully executing change. So
more good days, more bad days.
a little, probably more bad days.
Try not to be a downer. Mike.
Yeah, I'll try and.
From my standpoint, it all comes down to clarity and communications and prioritization. I take every objective that my team sets out for the year and I map it back to our strategic priorities. At the beginning of the year, we have 2 strategy sessions with my team. And we look at what's achievable, where does the money draw the line, and then we draw the line where the double money would draw the line. And we challenge them to say, this is what an average year looks like, this is what a good year looks like, and this is what a great year looks like. But constantly communicating, drawing those strategic plans with forced prioritization as well. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, and too often than not, many of the lower ranks of the organization just don't know when to choose. If they have a limited amount of time, they have 1 hour left in the day, how do you get them to choose the thing that's going to change the future of the company, the thing that's going to add the most value, not the easy thing to do? And so we spend a lot of time on communications and clarity and mapping every single task we do and objective we do back up to the corporate strategy.
And does that who's involved in that process?
So it starts with our enterprise leadership team sets the objectives and long-range plan. Then we set the strategic objectives for the year in an annual plan. We set the financial objectives that go along with that annual plan, and then that's cascaded to the ELT members. Mm-hmm. It goes down through each levels. I take that plan, and then because I'm in IT, we have an operational aspect too, which doesn't come out of that enterprise leadership team. But I map that to the cost savings objectives, to the financial objectives, to the strategic objectives in the best way possible. And with the exception of cybersecurity, which is more of a risk function, everything else can be mapped. And if it isn't, I look at cutting costs. I look at reducing the effort and reducing the prioritization on that aspect of my organization for that year. And it does change from year to year.
Very good. Irving, help us round this out.
So let me give a similar answer to Michael's, which is effective communication. But in my case, let me focus on disruptive innovations, transformational innovations, the kinds of things that are very new. And let me give an example from my long career in IBM. So in 1995, at the end of 95, IBM decided to embrace the internet across the whole company, and I was appointed the general manager of the new internet division. And I remember meeting with Lou Gerstner, who's our then CEO, who is, by the way, the top strategist, bar none, I've ever met in my life. And I said, well, Lou, what does it mean to have an internet division? And he said, well, Irving, that's your job. And he was very clear that a huge part of my personal job as the general manager was to figure out how to communicate what it was we were trying to do with the internet to all external constituencies, customers, press, financial analysts, partners, but very important to our internal people within IBM. And in fact, one of the advice Lou gave me is, Irving, if you tell the people within the company, this is what we need to do, they may say, that's bull, we won't do that. If you give an interview with the New York Times or with Paul Michelman, who then, an article in the Sloan... I love being
associated with the New York Times.
An article, or an article with the Sloan Management Review, then the people from the company will read it, and they'll say, wow, this is a big deal. And so he made a point of saying that, at least in the first few years, communications of this strategy was a huge part of my job on our team. And I think that companies don't pay enough attention in communications, and as a result, neither the people in the marketplace nor their own employees have a good idea of what it is one is trying to achieve.
And so part of your strategy, your deliberate strategy, was to communicate internally via external sources.
That was one of the things for sure. I mean, I had to do the external sources to get it out there, but the most effective way for the people inside to know what I was doing was to read the external sources rather than me sending internal memos of what we were doing.
So I love that, and I can see in that circumstance where it would work, IBM and the internet, that's a pretty sexy topic. But we're not all in such a, right, and I think it's a very clever strategy, and so nothing I'm saying is meant to take away from that at all. But I wonder if we're not all in that kind of position. And so, Anthony, I'm gonna turn this one over to you. What are some techniques that you're using, that you have used, for communicating strategy and priorities?
I mean, I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's a magic formula. You know, communicate consistently, clearly, and in the context of your strategy. You know, good old-fashioned hard work, energy. But I do think that there's a couple of steps, right? I think that, first of all, the senior team actually needs to agree on what the strategy is. And remember it, okay? I think your stats were very, they're just fascinating and a tad bit scary. And I'm not doubting them, but it's wild. So, you know, just having the senior team aligned and kind of shaking their heads. One thing that we've used and continue to use that I think is effective, independent of what, you know, the topic is, you know, there's ebbs and flows in business, right? So whether you have an annual kickoff or quarterly event or something like that, you have the ability to, you know, use that as your platform to explain the strategy contextually. And we would start with multi-layers, right? So your people managers, your VPs and above, you know, not to be exclusive, but just to be practical about it. And then have the C-levels or the functional leaders then talk about their annual plans in the context of that strategy, similar to what Mike was just saying, and kind of link back what your priorities are to that strategy. Down literally to the level of funding, literally to the level of programs. And then, you know, we would ask the same in return for the functional leaders in terms of them, you know, doing that with their folks. I work for a smaller company now, Trace3, and thanks, Cathy, for reminding my marketing department would kick me if I didn't say, you know, what we did. Sorry for the infomercial, but we are an IT solutions, you know, company. Our differentiation is customer intimacy, and we bring new tech to our enterprise customers through an extensive list of venture capitalists that we've maintained for a while, and a very high engineer to sales ratio, right? So that's, you know, that's kind of what we do. That company today, our company today, 450, will be 500 by the end of the year. I've worked for companies that have, you know, tens of thousands of employees. We would actually even require training, just like code of conduct training, you know, like you'd have to certify for security training. You know, you would have your code of conduct training, and then you would have your strategy training as well. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think it's horses for courses. And, you know, I think once you kind of pick it, you stick to it.
So in the scenario you were describing, kind of the annual process, was that kind of straight top down? In other words, it was just kind of going one layer. I hate to talk in such strict kind of hierarchical terms. It's not very 2018 to be doing that. But was that what the process was?
It really was. It really was. And it was even, I mean, it started with our CEO, but it actually, what preceded that was rigorous debate at the board level, okay? With the general board, and then also these were public companies, and then with a subset of the board, you know, that was actually, quote, the strategy committee. So when you talk about the top down, it was literally the board, and then that just kind of followed through like that.
Got it.
That's right, yeah.
So Cathy, what have you seen work in terms of communicating priorities?
I think companies, and I guess I have the advantage of getting to observe lots of different companies and how it works and how it doesn't. I recognize the process you are both describing. One of the interesting flips, I think, is we all know what we're trying to do. Do we know why? Context is often missing. We talk a lot about what, but why are we doing it? What are the market factors? Is it threat? Is it opportunity? Is it risk? And I think that just helps really cement the message at the highest of levels and give purpose to the activities once they do come down the organization. And then just flipping that, something I think works well is, what happens if we don't do this? What happens if we do nothing? Because in large business, inertia is one of the most powerful influences out there, and it's very tempting to just accept business as usual and a go-forward strategy, and what you realize too late in the game is that you've chosen something far worse than execution. So by talking about the risk of not doing anything or failing against the strategy, I think it's helpful to reinforce the why as well.
So these all sound like great techniques to kind of get people moving in the same direction, right? People recognizing what's important at both a broad level and then at a pretty specific level. Seems like that's a hard enough problem to address to begin with, right? So I need to make sure that that's really clear. But how do you keep people like at that spot they were on day one? So Mike, I'm gonna turn the mic over to you. What does this look like 6 months later?
You know, it's constant reinforcement. I mean, it's just constant reinforcement. And yes, it's a top-down process that we use, but at the high level, I can tell you with absolute certainty, I've worked for the same CEO now at Land O'Lakes for 8 years, and I was in several roles, and his 5 strategic objectives have not changed for 8 years. They've been tweaked. We've talked about different action plans each year and different objectives each year, but the 5 strategic priorities are such core to that mission. And so it's that constant adjustment during the year, the constant communication, explaining to people the value that each individual brings to help achieve that objective is critical. You want them to make sure that they feel like they're a part of something bigger, of something grander. And you don't focus on the number. The number is the metric at the end of the day. But the strategy then, if you execute it well, you deliver on what you promised your customers, at the end of the day, the money then rolls up and it gets there. And I think too many times companies flip it around. They target the number first and aren't quite sure how they're going to get there, which leads them to yanking the organization back and forth in different ways to try to meet a number. And so if you have a good strategy and you believe in that strategy, you got to see it through. Making sure people are tied into that in everything they do is just absolutely critical.
And that takes a great deal of courage from the top, I would think. And Irving, I mean, I'd love to hear your reflections on this from IBM. You got people all aligned from some great New York Times articles. How did you keep them?
Well, it was more than from the great New York Times. If you're doing a disruptive transformation and you don't have the top leadership team of the company behind you, it's all over. Because it's hard enough to execute a strategy when everybody's behind you. If they are not behind you, you just won't be able to do that. That's something I've learned. But I think it's constant repetition. For example, I like, you sent me some papers when we first talked about the panel on some articles you have published to the effect that in Sloan Management Review, to the effect that there has been a lot of research on strategy formulation, but there has been little research on strategy execution. I don't know if you talked about it in the introduction.
No, not so much, yeah.
Which is really interesting. Why haven't people done research in strategy execution? And I think it's because strategy execution is very much, as we have said, continuously doing it. So you talk to people, you tell them whatever, but you don't just do it once, train them, and then go away, because things change. And so you have to come back and you have to factor in what has changed, and then you have to work, and the papers made this point, simplification is critical to strategy execution. If the people that are supposed to execute, let alone the marketplace, doesn't understand what you're talking about, you know, you can give them papers, you can do a lot of management, you can do a lot of meetings, but if they don't understand, they don't understand. And simplifying, in fact, I would even make a point, in manufacturing, we learned maybe in the 80s the whole notion of design for manufacturability. I would say when formulating a complex strategy, you should only formulate strategies that have been designed for execution. Now, that may seem like a silly phrase, but if you formulate a strategy that is way too complicated and nobody knows how to simplify, you're wasting your time. So constant simplification, communication, and try to get to as many people as possible.
It's a great observation, and I want to tie something. I think at least 3 of you, if not all of you, have talked or at least intimated that a lot of this comes down to the individual, right? Organizations are nothing but groups of individuals who have a certain amount of free will, at least, and hopefully a lot. I'm looking now for, to the extent that you can draw on these, some kind of specific examples, tools, techniques that you've used in your organizations or you've seen effective at really connecting with individuals, both so they understand the strategy, so they understand why the strategy makes sense, and so they understand how what they do, no matter what it is, pushes the company forward to succeeding at that strategy. And so now I'm looking for some gummy techniques.
I think it all comes down to compensation. I mean, I really do, and it doesn't matter whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit organization. I mean, it's inconceivable to me to think of a strategy that is articulate and clear that doesn't have linkage to not only senior folks, but to customer-facing and non-customer-facing. It starts with sales, right? How are they incentivized? How are they comped? Then you have interesting tools like gates and accelerators and spiffs, right? And it doesn't stop with the salespeople. In fact, I'm sure, how many folks here in the audience have built things that salespeople go and sell, right? If you're right, part of tech, part of IT, we've done it for years. If you have a product to deliver, a feature, a portal, a vendor relationship, you can tie that directly back to compensation, right? So it's not just a customer-facing. I think it could be support organizations. In fact, I go so far as to say, Paul, that if a company wants to do something and it is not directly tied to compensation in some way, shape, or form, that's a red flag. It ain't getting done.
We in academia understand that all too well, as you can imagine. Anybody else want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think the question is, how do you create accountability within massive organizations and at the individual level? I love what we said earlier today. It was said that the definition of culture is what happens when the boss leaves the room. So we'd love to think that self-motivation and purpose is that easy to proliferate across tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. So in the absence of that strength of culture, creating accountability, what we've found is that for a project, again, at the infrastructure level, tying it to economic value. It doesn't always have to be operating expense, but if we take a metric, a target metric, whether it's retention or error or speed to market, really quantifying that in dollar terms, and then pairing that with an oversight from executive sponsorship and leadership so that there is ongoing governance and stewardship at the root level to say, okay, we've deviated from plan, it's quantifiable to your point, and yes, there is accountability, and you will have then the negative consequence from a compensation perspective. So a couple of things that we've seen work well.
Great. So I want to kind of pivot this conversation to a related topic. But first, I want to remind folks that we're using Slido. I see a bunch of questions coming in. Thank you. Please feel free to keep sending in more and voting on those that you'd like to see asked. One of the, at any large organization, or probably even not so large organization, there are multiple strategies. There are these strategic priorities that I talked about at the opening that are meant to kind of govern the entire organization. But then you've got different strategies. And given our audience and given your backgrounds, I want to talk a little bit about your point of view on alignment between corporate business strategy and technology strategy. I think, and I know this has probably come up in some other conversations today, but I think it's germane to the strategy execution gap. I think for a lot of years, companies that aligned their technology strategy and their business strategy were lauded, and that was seen as best practice. I think there's a school of thought that's emerging that says that can actually hamper agility. And I'd love to kind of hear, and any one of you kind of dive in to start off your point of view on what is the right alignment between tech strategy and business strategy.
Look, in my opinion, the whole point of a strategy is to succeed in the marketplace. Now, to succeed in the marketplace, you may need to do things in the research labs and in development labs, but I cannot imagine a strategy, remember, we're talking about a business, not MIT, where you say, no, our job is to succeed in our R&D labs and screw the marketplace. I cannot imagine that. I can imagine a strategy that says we want to succeed in the marketplace, and one of the things we need to figure out is what we need to do ourselves in-house and what we need to partner. So a lot of the innovation is to succeed that. So in fact, I would say, for a long time, I think we've thought that the most agile software strategy is to build it on top of stuff that you don't have to build. So that's why platforms are so interesting. Either you build it on a platform that exists, or you partner with somebody that has the technology so you don't have to do that. But especially in today's world, get to the marketplace as quickly as you can, because that's where the real learning will happen. So it would be interesting to hear an example of what you said, where focusing on the marketplace, your customers, is hampering the technology, but I cannot imagine what that...
I wish I had one. I think the argument was that at a time when things are shifting so much, that you can be hampered by having too tight alignment. So, Mike.
So, I firmly believe that any good technology strategy should be in support of an excellent business strategy. And as long as that business strategy is rooted in the value you provide to consumers or customers or benefactors in any way, shape, or form. However, with one exception, and that is when there's disruption, right? And when there's massive disruption in your marketplace, technology has a unique ability to inform or change the business model. And I'm not saying I have the solution to that, but that's where the technology organization, technology strategy needs to take on more of a leadership role and play in the business strategy to talk about how we're going to defend against this disruption, or how we're going to disrupt ourselves to get ahead of the marketplace, or how we're going to lean into alternative business models where we may invest in startups on the side to go after that marketplace in a different way. And so, I'm still a firm believer that it's got to enable that business strategy. We talk about the how, not the exact what goal. We try to do that in support. But at the end of the day, we're seeing a lot more conversation now talk about this disruption. And this is where IT leaders, digital leaders have to take a leading role in helping develop that new strategy around disruption.
And can I add a clarification to my point? When I said you have to bring it to the marketplace, if your strategy is based on a disruptive technology, the best people to do that are people who understand the technology. Because if you say, no, we'll use, I don't know, a PR company, they know this much, and any good customer would say, get the hell out of here. So that's why increasingly the role of the key technologists in the companies, whether we call them CIO, CTO, or CDO, roles that seem to be merging, is to be very involved in working with the business to get to and explain the business strategy, including all the technology ramifications. So I think that's one of the perhaps most profound changes of technologies within companies, is to be very involved in the marketplace.
And that's evocative of something that came up in an earlier panel, and that the notion of integration versus alignment. So Cathy or Anthony, do you want to add to this part of the conversation?
I don't think you can separate technology and business strategy anymore. Today is a day all about that. But the pace at which technology continues to change really requires a tight alignment. Business strategy just can't shift that much. We'd all go crazy if we adjusted business strategy at the highest of level. You've had the same strategic priorities for 5 years. And I think it does take courage to stay the course and to measure and see it through. On the other hand, things shift quickly in the technology sectors. So what makes better sense than having the executive committee, the top executives rely upon the technology leadership, whether you call it the CDO, the CIO, et cetera, to integrate and shift thoughtfully in alignment with the strategy. So in short, I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I agree with, I'm in violent agreement with the majority of this, but there's a tad maybe that is worth mentioning. Yeah, if you just take face value, in some way, shape, or form today, every company is a tech company, right? It's just, it's almost, it's axiom, right? It's an axiom. But what is a little worrisome is the superficial nature, you know, from what I've seen, you know, and that there's a genuine understanding of the types of technologies that it takes to actually grow a business, to take cost out of a business, to, you know, enter a new business area. And I think there's a huge gap between, you know, technology informing a business strategy and then the genuine understanding of the cost and pace of change that is necessary in order to execute. And that helps widen that gap that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. All right, let's go to Slido because we've got some great questions here. I'm going to begin with this one. What are some ways to, A, get the executive leadership to acknowledge that organizational politics is a big impediment to the execution of strategy, and one of you mentioned this early on, and to get them to focus on actually addressing the issue and removing political barriers? Who wants to start with that hot button topic?
I guess I brought it up.
Right.
So I would love to see a study that quantifies the impact of politics and whether it's a negative or a positive ROI. It feels like a negative ROI to me, but that's just walking the halls of large enterprise. That said, absent the research, I do come back to economic value, and anything can be quantified. So where you see, and I've seen all sorts of crazy stories, distraction because someone's, you know, the XCOM member's iPad took precedent over a claims processing deployment. I mean, I guess that's a flavor of politics managing up. Or two competing organizations within one enterprise racing to deploy the same infrastructure. These things can be quantified, and when it gets to a point of disruption, I think then you bring it forward to the executives and they have to make the hard decision. But it's a lot easier to make those decisions when you can quantify it and say, oh, we're off course, or this is costing, and then to cut through that. But I think it's hard to even open up the conversation.
Yeah, so who owns the responsibility for, even before we get to the conversation, who owns the responsibility for identifying when it's politics in play and when it's problematic?
Well, it's got to be the senior leadership team. I mean, you know, and by very definition, they are the political challenges themselves, right? So, you know, to me, it comes down to all the studies that experts like MIT do on the effectivity of teams, right? Is it a fully functioning, agreeable team with aligned priorities, division of responsibilities, and all working and pulling in the same boat at the mission level, at the goal level, at the incentive level? And quite frankly, when I've worked in companies where the politics have been extremely harsh, one team even called itself the meat eaters, and they enjoyed that.
With pride.
With pride,
Yeah.
and it was dysfunctional, right?
Yeah.
And I think the leadership team I'm a part of now is very, you know, there's still politics. It's Minnesota nice politics, but we each respect each other's space. We each have a role to play, and when there's conflict, we resolve it outside of the sphere of the larger organization, so it doesn't impact their performance. We work together against those common goals, and as long as you keep focused on those common goals, I think you can get around it. But part of your responsibility as a senior leader, as a CIO, is to help identify, bring it to the surface, and resolve it as quickly as possible.
So are you, as a leader, and I guess, Mike, since I'm going to stick with you on this because you brought it up. I mean, when you're hiring, when you're identifying people for promotion, I mean, are you thinking about their ability to play nice? I mean, how much does this factor into decisions about people?
It does a lot. I look at my leadership team, and this is from my historical background. I played baseball in college, and I look at that team on the field. And if you want to win games, you got to have the right person in the right position. Sometimes that's changing the role. Sometimes that's changing the objective. Sometimes that's going and getting a free agent, right? Or getting a consultant in to fill a gap you may have. And so I've reorged, since I've been CIO for 5 years, I've reorged almost every 6 to 8 months like clockwork to adapt to the changing organizational demands on my organization and the growth in our company. And so I'm constantly looking at it and constantly changing.
You know, most studies, and this was discussed in an earlier panel, that have looked at what are the most important skills to succeed in business today, put social skills at the top. Mm-hmm. I mean, the ideal is to have really good social skills and really good cognitive or quantitative skills. That's the ideal. But if you have to be a little bit better in one than the other, the social skills are by far the most important. And that gets back to the point Michael brought up, because part of social skills is really to just accept that, you know, politics is just human relations. So do your best to get people to work in a team, and, you know, expect that people, you know, just like extended families are sometimes dysfunctional, and you do your best to get along over Thanksgiving and so on, you're doing everything you can to do that. At the end, if it turns out that some members of the team are just totally dysfunctional, I think you have to let them go if it becomes impossible. And that principle has to come down from the very top. You guys have to get this goddamn thing done, and you can work it out, you can try to get along, but if I have to step in and make a decision, I'll just have to let somebody go. And I've seen that happen, and I'm sure you have, or maybe have even let people
Cathy,
go.
how connect this back, kind of the strategy discussion for us. How does this play out?
Yeah. So I guess you know, politics often it has a negative connotation, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, right? The original question said, hey, you know, what are some ways that you can overcome this, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would offer to this audience the following: play connect the dots. Play connect the dots, right? And it goes back to once this senior team has actually agreed on what the strategy is in front of the CEO, peel off 2 or 3 of them: the CIO, the head of marketing, the head of sales, right? Pick another C-level, and write down on a board, right? They can do it themselves, and you don't need a high-priced consultant to facilitate this, right? You know, what is it that you're doing today, and what do you think needs to change in order to do your part of the strategy? It's fascinating. If you do it in front of your peer, it's fascinating, because what happens very quickly is, you know, what I'm doing with Cathy could potentially overnight change, or with Mike or Irving, it could change. But it's up on the board. And then what you have to do is say, I can't do that anymore if I'm supposed to be doing this over here, right? And when you're doing that in front of your peer, now it doesn't solve it, but it calls it to light.
Right.
How often are you doing that?
How often are you doing it? I think you've got to do this literally, in the beginning, weekly, monthly. And you know, it was, in my case, I'm referring to, you know, recently, it was a CIO, because they're the ones that have a lot of the resource constraints. The CMOs typically are asking for everything, okay? And the sales guys typically don't care, okay? I'm joking. But
I mean with every C-level executive for 30 minutes every 6 weeks or less. And it's probably one of the hugest amount of time I spend, because it's those personal relationships that give me the ability to influence them and work with them and figure out what their challenges are and adapt to their needs and continually revise what my team's doing.
How often are you talking about strategy and alignment to strategy in those conversations?
I would say it's the context for every conversation.
Yeah.
But you know, is it is it, hey, we're changing the strategy? No, I mean, we're doing that in group once a year.
Right.
But when we talk about problem, it's typically problem, you're managing by exception, but it's only the big rocks. We're not talking about why their iPhone didn't get rebuilt by my department that day, or the challenges they had in one division with a network going out. Right. We're talking about, hey, this project, which is critical to our strategic objective, isn't getting there, or hey, I'm not getting the resources I need from your organization to have a successful implementation. And so we're talking about those big items.
One of the most important parts of social skills is the notion of empathy. And empathy means, if you don't like what I'm doing, as an example, is try to understand why you don't like it. Try to put myself in your shoes. Let me give an example. So, especially a few years ago when cloud was just coming up, if a CIO says we're going to have a major cloud implementation here, and the head of the data center is upset, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to know why this person is upset. He or she may say, what about my job? What about, shoes for my children when I no longer home? I'm being totally serious. If you can anticipate the reaction, understand the reaction, and then have the conversation, including you write things on the board, including explain why you're doing it, even what role they would have in the future, if they have a role. If they don't have a role, at least you're putting the cards on the table. That's a very reasonable conversation to have. If you don't treat it this way, which I would call the empathy, you just say, hey, I make the decisions, then it turns political because in the negative sense of politics, because people are just talking past each other. At least if the cards are on the table, the other person may not like what you're doing, but they can understand we have to go with a cloud-based decision. We can no longer do this. I will try my best to find work for you and the teams, and let's try to do that together. And I think that when we talk about social skills, we don't just mean take people out to dinner and play golf or whatever. We mean precisely knowing how to deal with these kinds of contentious issues that will always come up in any team.
And so what you're saying, if I understand, is how we're communicating with each other day to day in both formal and informal ways is probably a considerably more influential aspect of effective strategy execution than we would think of when having a conversation like this.
Yes.
So let's stay on that. And we've been talking about this a little bit, but there's another question here that is very popular. And it's a statement. But I think a lot of people in the audience agree with it. And I would actually ask you, again, I'm going to let anyone volunteer to express your level of agreement or disagreement. Culture trumps strategy every time. Agree? Disagree?
Agree.
Yeah.
But it's your job to change the culture.
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
if you're a senior leader, it's your job to change
Well, so
the
let me
culture.
ask you a question. And Anthony, I think, can you have one with that? Can you succeed with only one? Either one?
I guess I'm hesitating. Culture means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? I think I understand what the context of the question is, but boy, I don't know. I don't know how you can develop a cohesive strategy without having the cultural foundation. I don't know how you can, and vice versa. I don't know how you can have a cultural foundation without some kind of common ground alignment on what it is that you need to accomplish, okay?
So what comes first in that scenario?
Well, it seems
that an
to me
impossible
that to the extent that culture is malleable, and it's not, it's very difficult. It's that intangible aspect of businesses that everyone strives to shift and change, I would think to the extent culture is malleable, it would follow strategy. It would support what the core business strategy is and follow through. So there's different levels of culture as well, right? There's the broader level of who we are and how we share a common purpose, regardless of what that purpose is. And then there's the type of team culture and dynamic that you're alluding to here that fosters open and honest communication. Not in all cases is there empathy in a particular conference room, and that is an aspect of individual leadership. So I think it follows strategy.
So, Cathy, what happens when a company changes strategy in that scenario? I mean, do leaders need to step back and say, well, is our culture out of tune now with this new strategy?
I sure hope they do.
Yeah.
And I know that decades ago, long-term employment and loyalty to the firm was a real issue. And now as purpose changes, as strategy changes, I think team members need to change as well. And that's the new workforce we're talking about.
Yeah, I would say, again, I'm sorry to be talking about my personal experience like from IBM, but
that's why you're here.
That's what I know the most about. I would say the reason I said Luke Gerstner is such a great strategist, he wrote this wonderful book, Who Says Elephants Can Dance, and he talked all about culture. I mean, I've taught courses based on that case study at MIT, and that's been one of the books I asked the students to read, because for him to transform IBM, he had to work really hard to transform IBM from his previous culture that was a very good culture for the, let's say, mainframe days. That was a very different world, to the new culture of the 90s, Silicon Valley, et cetera, proprietary, open, and so on. And he knew that instinctively, and he worked hard to change the culture. He could never have succeeded in transforming IBM, which would have meant IBM would have gone out of business if he hadn't worked on culture. And I suspect, especially for complex strategies, they just won't succeed if the culture of the company is in conflict with the key principles you need to execute this strategy.
Very good. So I think we have time for a short answer to one more question. So I'm looking for one that is kind of finite. Here we go. What percentage of time should a CIO, and I'm just going to say this, I'm going to expand this to a C-level executive. What percent of time should they invest in strategy to drive execution? How much, day in, day out, week to week, how many hours should you be focused on this particular topic? Mike?
25%.
25% on strategy?
Yeah.
I'm going to go 50-50. Well, higher on strategy, definitely staying in touch with execution and tracking it, but counting on teams to drive it at a lower level and monitor.
Irving, after you.
Yeah, I would go with the higher figure, 50, say.
So I think it's more strategy in the beginning. Once the strategy is set, it's 75% execution, and then checking back in on the strategy.
Okay.
Once it's set, you're all in.
On that note, panelists, thank you very much. Audience, thank you very much.